going to move straight to inviting Jodie to come and give us her presentation to continue this theme of boldness, innovation and global to local. I'll introduce Jodie to you while she's coming across the stage. Jodie grew up on a farm around Gawler, which created an early interest in reusing and recreating things. With a background in civil and environmental engineering and arts, Jodie has 15 years' experience in corporate sustainability, life cycle thinking, and the circular economy, both in Europe and Australia. She's a very well-travelled lady. She returned to Australia in 2016 after 12 years in France, where she was responsible for developing and coordinating the Northern France's circular economy strategy and developing a collaborative life cycle platform, working closely with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. In her spare time, she enjoys a good cup of tea and French cheese, although not necessarily together. Her presentation will explore the importance of caring for our land here in South Australia with a supply chain approach in the circular economy. And please welcome me. Please welcome me. What am I saying? Please join me in welcoming Jodie to the lectern.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak here. I've had to kind of admit last night to a couple of people that I can't grow anything, so I'm really, really uncomfortable with you guys. I have trouble if I get my kids actually dressed and wearing the same shoes on the same days. You know, a big thing for me. So I come more from the economic side of things, which is why I'm wearing a grey suit. But so Leanne said I've just spent 12 years in France, but I am a Adelaide girl. And I came back so that I could watch my kids run around and climb up trees barefoot, sort of have that part of their childhood as well. And it's been a really interesting experience for me, adapting to a completely different culture over there, learning a lot about how they collaborate and how business works over there, and then coming back here and finding out all the great stuff that's happening in South Australia. So a lot of what I'm really passionate about is bringing together sort of the international perspective with all the amazing strengths we have here in South Australia. Now, I just wanted to start off, has anyone had this picture come up recently in their Facebook page? Okay, you're not moving in the same circles as I am, that's okay. I'm a life cycle assessment geek, so in our area we do a lot of quantification around the life cycle impacts of products and services on the environment. So we do a lot of calculating, you know, what's the impact of that chair and that cup of coffee you're drinking, what's the impact of that on carbon and water, and we quantify it over the entire life cycle. And when you start getting into that science, it's actually quite depressing because you realise you look at that cup of coffee and you start picturing where everything's growing and where the water's coming from and how the cup gets washed and then what happens at the end of the cup getting washed. So this little cup of coffee comes to your table and it has this huge baggage associated with it. And once you can see that, it's quite a depressing world to live in. So a lot of what I've been doing is trying to flip that around. And this study was released just last week by some Swedish scientists, and it was about talking to us about what sort of impacts the different things we do to try to improve our environmental impact really mean. So the ones on the left, the low impacts, are sort of recycling and changing light bulbs and things like that. And it goes all the way over to the right, and the big mega impact on the right-hand side is actually having one less child. So I get documents like this, and I feel quite challenged and depressed by that, because on the left-hand side, it's all the stuff that we actually in the power to do, and we see that really does not do much on the big scale of things. And then on the right-hand side, if we really, really care about the planet and we really want to keep the planet going later, we should probably not have any children, and maybe we should just stop right now. And I find that a really difficult space to be in, that, you know, we need to get rid of ourselves to make this planet better. And I love being with you guys because you're focused on what value you can add back to the environment and back to nature. And these calculations don't tend to have that aspect. But the other thing they say to me is that if we really, I don't think we can depend on individuals making individual choices to really change the end game now. We're in a linear economic system where we take stuff, we make it, we chuck it out, and there is so much wastage in that system, and fiddling around the edges with individual choice is only going to have very limited benefits. I passionately believe that we need to change that system. I would love to have people doing better things without even knowing, doing it because it's easy. And I challenge myself sometimes to sit down in Wakefield shopping centres and watch mainstream and you know, the optic that they're in, that, you know, you buy your cheap shit at Kmart and, you know, you have your takeaway stuff in your takeaway beverage cups, and that's normal. And until we can move that, I think we're having limited impact. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this thing called circular economy, which feel free to add that to your buzzword bingo list. I'll happily admit that it is a buzzword, but it's actually a framework that pulls a lot of different thinking together that's quite interesting. And so in Europe, I'd been working on sustainability for years and sort of struggling to get traction. And you'd work with one business and there'd be a whole lot of programs that get going, and then someone moves and all the programs kind of flop apart again. And it was really hard to get them to really put it into the core of what they were doing. It was always that fluffy bit, that add-on that gets cut out at the next budget cycle. But then something happened with the circular economy that flipped all the language on its head and got businesses really excited about, well, actually, if I move my business model, this could actually be the future of what I do. And governments are doing the same thing, especially in Europe, saying, okay, we need to invest in this because this is where our jobs and growth are going to come from. So I think similar to what Keith was saying about some of his Indigenous people, that they know that if they don't do those programs, in Africa, that if they don't do those revegetation programs, they're not going to live. When people see this stuff as core business, it really changes the way they work. And in Europe, there's a huge number of companies working on this and actually lobbying governments to move on this. But there's also sort of governments at every level, at the city level, regional, country, and whole of European level, that are really moving legislation and policy and investing in this area. So what is the circular economy? This is a very complicated diagram, but I think I'd like you to be able to hook some of the things that you're doing onto this diagram in the future. So bear with me. For me, circular economy is about keeping products first, components and materials at their highest value in our economic system for as long as possible. So we're trying to kind of pull out as much value as we can of the things that are rotating in our economic system. There's three sort of big principles around this. The first is actually designing things to make less waste and to have less impact on the environment. So things that can last longer, things that are modular, things that are actually made to stick around and last better. Then once they're in the economic system, so they're in the marketplace and we're buying them and they're sitting on the table, how do we keep them cycling at a highest value as possible? And I'll go into detailed examples after of different methods around that. And we tend to talk about keeping them in technical material cycles and biological material cycles. So your metals, for example, you can really make them work hard and get them back again and again and again. Biological materials, you tend to want to cascade down and get the nutrients out of. You can't use a piece of cotton again and again and again for the same use. And the third principle is all about giving back. So actually providing more ecosystem services and getting those nutrients back to the soil to rebuild soil. So I think that's the space where you guys are are most in the circular economy already. So if we have a quick look at some technical material examples, so what we're trying to do is keep products running for longer, so prolonging their product life, and then once they can't be used anymore, taking them apart and reusing components, and then eventually recycling. But recycling is very much the last part of the chain. So an example of strategies where you really turn whole business models on their head so that this actually works. I always use the photocopier example that 20 years ago we all bought a photocopier and we'd spend our time swearing at it because it didn't work, and you had to call the repair guy and get him to come back in, and then he'd give you a quote for some really expensive new machine. And I remember the frustration of trying to get that machine back. No one has that anymore because no one owns a photo, like businesses just don't own photocopiers anymore. Canon and Fuji, they all own the photocopiers, and we just pay per copy, right? But what we don't realise is that there's this amazing sort of chain behind all that means that they now design their photocopiers to last a really, really long time, to use less energy. There's remanufacturing facilities in most countries in the world. So the photocopier that you're getting is actually largely remanufactured. So we don't really care about all that stuff. All we want is a photocopy and not to be swearing at the machine. But in the meantime, there's been this whole business model built on the back end that has made that a whole lot more sustainable than it was 20 years ago. But we don't even necessarily talk about the environmental benefits because it's just a better business model. So Philips on the bottom photo is experimenting with that concept for lighting. So this is the Schiphol airport in the Netherlands, that the airport doesn't actually own the lights. They pay per lux. So they pay for the amount of light that is in their airport space. And Philips actually owns the lighting. So they design it so it's optimised. If they've got new technology that they can flip over to be more energy efficient, they insert it themselves. So it's a really interesting kind of way to think about how we can access other types of things. And in the agricultural industry, so Caterpillar is one of the leaders in this as well, and they're offering more and more machinery on leasing conditions, and they actually have remanufacturing capacity behind all that as well. So that's a very easily accessible thing for you guys. I love this. I always put in this nearly new office furniture group up the top that's in Belgium, because the guy was such an amazing guy that I met. He was running a removalist business. So he was carting off office furniture from banks and from corporations and from governments that have great environmental policy, but they just change corporate colour from green to orange. So they've picked up all their furniture and made it go away, and that furniture goes to really low-end uses. Or because furniture's changing. We used to have like 80 centimetres desks when we had those big screens, and now they're all smaller. So everything's being changed over. So this is an example of a really great innovator, businessman, entrepreneur that said, well, that's silly. How about I take all that furniture and I just change the green bit and make it orange, or I cut it down. And so he actually bought a furniture sort of manufacturer place that could actually chop up and change things, and invested heavily in design so that he could actually make gorgeous furniture out of this stuff that was about to go into those awful sort of office things that you don't get any money for it. And he's going gangbusters. He can't keep up with the demand for companies wanting to do this because it actually costs them less, it looks great, and it feeds really well into their carbon story as well, that they've develop carbon. So I challenge the entrepreneurs to think about those kind of business models that make sense. Here in South Australia, has anyone met Uma Preston there? Some of you know Uma. She's great, isn't she? So she's working on systems, working with multiple farmers and product developers and community groups to get back plastic waste from farms, to collect them, sort of mutualised collections so that you can get enough volume, take them back, get them recycled into other agricultural products. That example is really important because it's about working in collaboration. One farmer trying to get rid of their pipes is not enough to make anything happen. Uma's pulled everything together to make the market economics stack up and make it easy for those farmers to recycle that waste. So we've got some great innovators here in South Australia. On the sort of biological material side of the chain, which is probably of most interest for you, we talk a lot about cascading. So the example in the wood sector, for example, is that you've got your wood, you make sort of hardwood products, you get that back, you recycle it, you might make MDF particle boards from it, and then the MDF might come back and get recycled into cardboard. So it's very much a chain. But what's really interesting as well is these aspects around sort of biorefineries and things like that, where you can actually get really, really high-end products out of that waste. So that down the bottom is a wood-based solvent product that's being manufactured in Tasmania out of sawdust. So sawdust in South Australia is shipped off to China to burn for $10 a tonne. So we're basically shipping water across the world to burn it and get a little bit of energy off it. This company is creating this solvent that's worth thousands of dollars a tonne and feeding that back into the European marketplace, where there's all sorts of legislation now to get rid of chemical products on the market. So they're really looking for naturally bio-based substances for that. So there's a lot of scope for sort of high innovation to rethink the value that's in the agricultural supply chain and add more value to the products that we could be shipping rather than just sending them to burn. And who knows Pete? Who saw Pete on the landline over the weekend? I didn't. My dad called me, and then the internet connection wasn't good enough to watch it last night, but apparently he was great. So Pete's been composting in South Australia for 30, 40 years. He's a farmer. But what I love about Pete is he really sees the value in the organic waste streams and does everything to get as much value back out of it. So he's developed these bio bin things that he places of chicken manufacturers that have dead chickens that they're trying to figure out how to manage their waste. He's actually developed this amazing technological kit that he can go and place on their farms that they put the dead chickens in, and it's quite a highly technical process to compost them down and create something great out of it. He also makes biodiesel to run his own trucks off of from oil. He's now got anaerobic digesters running up in Langhorne Creek, where he's gone to Japan and looked at latest technology and scaled it down and figured out with his farming know-how how to get it to scale and how to work here in South Australia. So that's the kind of thing where you can see these kind of big technological solutions, but you can actually develop new markets out of them and make that work as well. So Pete's a great part of the circular economy, and that's his anaerobic digesters up in Langhorne Creek, which I highly recommend that you visit. So how are people thinking about circularity in terms of food and the sort of food and ag sector? So I'm just going to flick through these, and I'll leave them in the pack so you can look at them more later. But in Denmark, they've sort of mapped through all the different opportunities around food waste and how to reduce them, how to get energy out of them. So they've really see what's now, food waste is just one of the biggest environmental issues on the planet. How can we transform that, reduce the amount of waste, and then just try to extract as much value out of it as possible in the economic city system. And in cities, it's such an important question as well, because we need food in cities. We have limited resource in cities, and they're so dense. This is from Glasgow, and this is mapping out all the potential linkages between different agricultural sectors. So how can energy and water flow from one to the other, and nutrients flow from one to the other? So it's about how do we rethink sort of industrial capacity and place them together and get those values flowing more so they become more competitive as well. And this is Amsterdam's looking at it as well, and they've actually plotted it sort of geographically. Where are things being produced? Where are things coming up? Where can we put anaerobic digestion? Where do we need to change our farming and things like that? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on at a global scale on this. And this, again, I'll leave in your kit so you can read it through slowly. But this report came out just 2 weeks ago from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who are the sort of leading global think tank around this. And they're looking at they're looking at cities and how cities play as the concentration of so much of our population, so much of our economic throughput, so much of our impact are in cities. So how does the different circular economy aspects work in cities, and they've actually thought through the bioeconomy side of things. So not just, so how do we get those nutrients from the city back to the soil and back through value streams, but also what does farming look like in the city? So what kind of urban farming could we imagine in the city, and vertical farming in the city, so that we've got more cycles through that way. Back to South Australia. So last year I was really privileged, this is when I was talking about coming back to South Australia and thinking that I'd be doing really boring work now because everything happens in Europe, and not at all. So last year I worked on a really interesting project with Green Industry South Australia to actually try to quantify, if our state was to transition to an economy that looked more like this rather than the linear economy that we have now, what kind of impacts could this bring to our state? Is it worthwhile pursuing from an economic standpoint? So I'm putting this website up every presentation I do and say, you have to go onto this website, creatingvalue.net.au, and there's actually a sign-up form there as well that we can keep you informed on where this project's going. So this was built on, there's been quite a few studies done in Europe about, you know, what are the benefits in terms of economic benefits, jobs benefits. So these are kind of macro studies. Is this worth pursuing for the UK or for Europe or for Germany, etc.? But nothing like that had been done here. And a lot of stuff had been done in the lead up to the Europe was working on a huge circular economy directive in 2015. So there was a lot of lobbying going on to say we really need this stuff. But this is the first one that has been done in Australia. So the methodology is, so it's an economic modelling exercise, right? And we look at the state economy now and we grow it to 2030. So what are all the normal growth curves that are happening in the economy? What is our economy going to look like to 2030? And we call that business as usual. And then we looked at all the efficient and renewable energy type of things that happen in a circular economy, because it's no good recycling stuff if you're just using coal. So what are all those buckets of assumptions that a circular economy would look like? And then what are all the material flows? What would that look like in a circular economy? And we rewired our economic system, the way different sectors purchase from different sectors to reflect this, and then brought them together to say, okay, so this is business as usual. This is what would happen if we just focused on energy. This was what would happen if we just focused on materials, and this is what would happen if we brought it all together. So I won't go through the assumptions. You can read all that. It's all publicly available. So jobs-wise, over 25,000 new jobs could be created by pursuing this. And a lot of that is because we're making the most value of the stuff that's in our economy. So rather than buying a cheap washing machine that there's a bit of retail value add when you buy it, and then it goes into the waste stream and there's a bit of waste management, a bit of recycling maybe. If we've got people, if we're buying more expensive washing machines maybe, but then we've got people on the ground that are repairing them and coming and checking on them, those are local jobs for our people. So we're actually creating more sort of service-based employment in our economy. But what's interesting is there's a bit of an 80-20 rule as well. So 80% of the jobs would come from that keeping products cycling and those material side of the things, and 20% from the energy side of the equation. And the carbon emission, of course, it kind of flips over. So you do get an extra 20% sort of benefit from these material strategies, which is important because there's a lot of logistics involved, right? If we're going to get these things back to where they need to be, that does mean sometimes more trucks on the road. So you've got to check that is the environmental benefit balanced by the extra effort that we have to do to get the stuff back. And it is, and we get 20% more carbon benefits than just working on renewable energy. So I'm almost ready to leave you. Now, I know we've walked straight into the economic side, but I wanted to challenge you guys, and I think Keith started to do that. We need to engage better with some of these mainstream sectors to push what things look like and not just be working around the edges. So that's what I'd like to challenge you to do. How can we engage better with the economy? And around Landcare and natural resource management as well. How can we make them see this as a benefit to what they're doing every day, and not just a fluffy add-on that they can give us a bit of money one year and then they take it away the next year, and we're always kind of dependent on that. So the other exciting thing that's happening in South Australia is that we're running a big conference in Tonsley. So has anyone been to Tonsley Innovation District? Yeah. It's pretty cool. It's the old Mitsubishi plant. So in and of itself, it's a real story about regeneration and transformation. So when the Mitsubishi plant closed in 2007-ish, there was about 800 people working on site. There's now over 1,000 people working on that site, in education, in R&D, there's tradies, there's all kind of different growth and stories happening there. So it's a really exciting site to come and see what's going on, and there's robots and driverless vehicles and crazy stuff like that. And we've got people coming from all around the world in November to come and share what they're doing in the circular economy, and also work with people here around it as well. So maybe we can talk about it more in the questions, but that's a really, really exciting thing that's happening. And people are coming from all around the country as well and investing in this. So South Australia is a leader in this area, and I think we should all be really proud of that. And that's all.